Hello everybody, welcome back to another training session. Today we're going to be talking about how to get your students speaking more. Especially we're talking about kindergarten students. And one of the sub aims of today's session are making sure that language development remains a key goal in all English lessons. We'll be talking a lot about this as the session goes on. So today's session is going to focus mainly on looking at some of those subjects that we're teaching which are not necessarily language focused and how we can make them language focused. So in this session in particular, we'll be looking at how to teach practical skills using a task-based approach, how to teach projects and art lessons, and just some general tips to get students speaking more. So practical skills. When we're talking about practical skills, we're talking about teaching life skills, skills to students through English. How do you feel about this subject? When I speak to teachers, they tend to feel like a little bit intimidated by this subject because they're not really sure how to approach it. But why do we have this subject? The reason that we have this subject is because there are lots of very important skills that we need to teach our kindergarten students. However, we teach this during English time, because it's a very good exposure to English. And one question I often hear is, how do you make one simple skill last for 3 or 4 lessons? So if we look at the syllabus, is that we see skills such as being grateful, learning to wash your hands, spreading jam or butter on a piece of bread. When you read it like that, it seems like the skill would just take 5 minutes to finish, and how can we possibly teach that over multiple lessons? Well, hopefully, after today's session, you'll have a better idea. One big question is, why study this in English, not Vietnamese? Well, to answer this question, we have to think about what are we actually going to teach them? Because if it's a very simple skill like learning to wash your hands, well, it would be easier to do this in Vietnamese, surely, because you could speak in language which they understand. You could guide them step 1, step 2, step 3. However, we have to think about the question, why do we have this subject in English? Well, it's quite simple, really, is that because we're not just looking at teaching them the skill, but we're also looking at a language output, a language goal. So when we're thinking about practical skills as a subject, we always have to have in mind that we're not just teaching the students how to do a skill and the students are listening to the English and performing the skill, but we always have to ask the question, what is the language goal for this lesson? So some common pitfalls that I see when I see teachers teaching this subject is maybe your first thought is, okay, I'll teach the words, I'll drill the pronunciation of the words so the students can remember them. We'll play some games with the words so students can really know the words, and then we'll do the skill. Another approach might be, okay, we'll get them to do the skill, then we'll do the skill again so they get better at it, then we'll learn the words, and then finally we'll wrap up by performing the skill again. Well, what's wrong with this approach? Well, let me explain. So the first one is that it's focusing on the vocabulary involved in the skill, and then ends with the completion of the skill. Well, the question is that, have they had any guidance on how to perform the skill, or is the skill just that final activity that they perform? Second question is that, okay, they're learning the vocabulary, but to do what? They're learning the vocabulary to potentially understand the vocabulary to perform the skill. So we have to ask the question, well, what is the language output? What are the students actually producing in this cycle? The second one, they're doing the skill, they're doing again, they learn the words, they do the skill. Well, okay, maybe it's a very skill-based approach, but what has the teacher actually helped them to get better at? Okay, maybe they've guided them on how to do the skill better among the process of doing the skill. But again, the question is that where is the language outcome? In number 2 is they're learning the language in order to better follow the actions of the teacher in order to perform the skill better. But in number 2, it would be more efficient to teach it in Vietnamese. In number 1 is, okay, there's a language focus, but there's no output focus. It's just focused on, can students understand these words in order to perform this skill? And the final output is the performing of the skill, where there's likely no talking or no speaking going on, because They've learned the vocabulary in order to understand how to perform the skill, not understand how to talk about the skill. So I'm going to present a different way of approaching it. My way of approaching is a task-based approach. And what we do is we start off by saying, what would they need to be able to perform this task, and what does success look like in this task? First of all, we start off with the task. The task means the skill. So it could be something like learning when to go, learning when to stop. It could be saying please, saying thank you. It could be interactions at a doctor's, whatever the syllabus has us to do. First thing is we think about language. Okay, what does success look like from a language perspective? And this means that what are we expecting students to be able to say? What are we expecting students to be able to produce? And then if this is our first step, it will help us to understand how we're going to break this down in terms of multiple lessons. Next, we need to make sure they have structured practice. Structured practice can be structured practice of the language. It could also be structured practice of the skill. We need to make sure that they have independent practice so that they're able to produce this independently, whether this is language or the skill. And finally, in a task-based approach, we normally have a reflection at the end. So they look back on how well they were able to do that, or how well they were able to perform the skill, or how well they were able to perform the language. So in terms of teaching this lesson, what does it look like? Well, first thing to think about is your final outcome. What is it that you want students to be able to do at the end of these 4 weeks? What is it you want students to be able to do after these series of lessons? Next, you have to think about the smaller behaviors. What do smaller behaviors mean? Smaller behaviors mean, so if we have one skill like learning when to go and when to stop, the smaller behaviors are, where do they stop? What clues do they look for? They look for green red light, a red light. So when we break it down, we know what things that need structured practice with in terms of the skill. And then in terms of language, we break it down into small parts. So if we want them to give a presentation, we have to break it down into small parts. So vocabulary, sentences, putting sentences together, building up to that presentation. And like I just said, is that we need to think about the language that they need to be able to complete the skill or complete that final outcome. And then we need practice activities. So if we follow this flow when we are planning a lesson, then it will make sure that it's not just teaching them to do the skill, do the skill, do the skill. And it's not just teaching them to learn the vocabulary, learn the vocabulary, learn the vocabulary with no clear purpose. But what we are going to do is we'll be learning about the skill, and we'll be learning the vocabulary in order that we are building up their ability to talk about the skill. So let's take a look at this. So what might this look like? Let's take the skill packing your bag, or having students pack their bags. So the final outcome would be that students can pack their bag independently and say what goes into their school bag. Small behaviors could be like identifying what should go in the bag and what shouldn't go in the bag. Maybe it could be about folding their clothes. The vocabulary item could be like fold it, put it in, take it out, in my bag I have. And then that final production that we want is depending on the student's level. If they're higher level, it could be that, okay, put it in, put it in, put it in. In my bag, I have a top, I have some milk, I have a water bottle. Right, so what does that look like in terms of lessons? So what I've done here is I've put 4 lessons together, and I want you to just pause this video, look at the lessons, and think about, if you were putting this together in a lesson, how would you order these lessons? So I'll give you maybe 5 seconds here to pause the video, read the different steps, and try to think that if you were doing this, how would you put it in order? Okay, so if it was me, what I would do is the first lesson would be about the bag detective. Say what things go in the bag and what things don't, and learn the vocabulary items. Why would this go first? Because we're exposing them to the skill, we're teaching them the small behaviors in the skill, and there's also a very clear language outcome, which is learning the vocabulary, which is aiming to build on it in future lessons. Next, what I would do is I would have the number 1. I'd have guided practice. So in teams that they could follow a checklist to pack their bags, to say what things they packed inside their bags. This would be a good way to expose them to the language you expect them to produce. So in this, I would look at my checklist and I would say, okay, in my bag, I have a water bottle, a top, a box of milk. And then the students could then have to pack it in their bags, and then they could practice saying these sentences in a guided way. My third stage would be practice vocabulary items of structure I have and draw the things that they want to put in their bag inside a template. So there, again, we're practicing the skill of recognizing what things should go in the bag, what things shouldn't go in the bag. They're practicing the longer structure and they're doing it in a very controlled way. And then we could get the more confident students to come up with their picture and to practice talking about their picture by saying that in my bag, I have, and pointing at the picture. And this is good because it's very structured practice, but it's something a bit different than them just packing their bag. Okay, now you pack your bag. Okay, now let's pack the bag in teams. Okay, now you watch me pack the bag. Because if they're just doing the same thing over and over and over again, I'm sure for the teacher it feels very repetitive, and for the student it feels very, very repetitive. Then finally, have them perform the skill independently and present about what they think they have in their bag. So then you can see that with this final stage, it's making very, very clear what is the language outcome and the skill outcome. Where the skill outcome is that can they put the correct things in their bag and put it inside their bag independently? And can they perform the language outcome by saying the things that they have in their bag? That then gives you, as the teacher, a great opportunity to evaluate, can they perform the skill? Can they perform the language output? If they can perform the skill but they cannot perform the language, well, it means that either the student, they need more time and support, or maybe we need to change about what the lesson's focus is to make sure there's enough time to perform that language output. Okay, next is identifying skills and language. So we asked the question, what does a skill look like? And if that to perform in real life, what would it look like? What language do they need to talk about the skill? So this is not something new, this is a concept we've been talking about all throughout this video. What smaller behaviors they need. So here I have some examples, and what I want you to think about, choose one of these examples, and again, if you have the time, pause the video and think about, okay, what would this look like? What would success look like? What language output would we want? And what smaller skills does this involve? Okay, we don't have time to talk about all of these today, so let's just choose one. Let's, for example, if it was something as spreading jam and bread and butter. So this one seems like a difficult one to plan because it seems like once you do the skill, the lesson's over. So what I would say is that, well, first of all, we have to think about if they're spreading it on bread, then, okay, how can we make sure that they understand that they need to be safe? How can we understand that they need to wash their hands first? How can we make sure that they understand that they have to clean up after themselves so they don't have to make it messy? In terms of language, maybe that they have to ask for the teacher's help. Maybe they want to say that I can wash my hands, I can spread, I can clean up. And then all of a sudden, it turns from just being a very, very basic skill, which is over within 2 minutes, to being a series of lessons where we're teaching students to make sure they have to wash their hands. We're teaching students language, which is repeating. So I can, I can, I can. So those sentence structures are being repeated again and again. Those sentence structures are being repeated again and again to make it easy for the students to understand. And there are different skills which they have to taught independently and learn to combine to be able to do this final skill. And that is a perfect example of how to teach practical skills, because it shows very clearly that a very simple skill, which looks simple, when we break it down into smaller behaviors and smaller language parts, then it all of a sudden there's a lot to do within one lesson. And when we have a lot to do in one lesson, well, that's wonderful, but we need time to be able to practice it in order to get to that language outcome. All right, and that is it for how to teach practical skills, how to get the most amount of language out of practical skills. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.